Okay, I think we'll make a start now then. So good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much for joining this Global Business Influencers webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name's James Torr, and I'm a director at Ipsos. I'm also delighted to be joined by Daniel Wong-Chi-Man this morning as well. Dan sits within our Global Audience Measurement team, and in terms of this morning, Dan's going to be talking a little bit more about the data, going into that, understanding the type of things that keep these people awake at night in the context of what's going on in the world today. But I'll kick things off and I'll give a bit of an introduction into global business influencers, the audience we're reaching, and I'll also talk about some developments, because while we've been reaching these types of audiences now for almost 50 years, we continue to make developments to these surveys, and that's what I'll touch a little bit on. I suppose a little bit of housekeeping before we start as well. We'll take any questions at the end. Please do write questions though into the chat function as we go through, and then we can then cover those off at the end. Now, in terms of the data you're going to see today, you're going to see some global data, you're going to see some data from the US, and also from North America as well, as we've just added Canada into the solution. You'll also see data from the GBI survey, but also the Barometer Recontact survey as well. Everything's sourced though, so you know what's coming from where on specific charts, and it's fairly clear, and we'll headline there as anything changes. So look, a little bit more about global business influencers and who they actually are. The first question we always get asked is who are global business influencers? Okay, and it's a dead easy question to ask. We can summarize this in one sentence. Global business influencers are those most senior business people in companies with 50 or more employees. Now, by definition, they're a pretty niche group of people. Okay, they represent about less than 1% of the population. But as we'll see, if you take into account things such as their influence, their spending power, and the budgets they control, they're a disproportionately important audience. So they represent the key to profitability for B2B, but also sectors such as finance, luxury goods and cars, airlines and hotels. And we're speaking to almost 14,000 global business influencers, and that's across Asia Pacific, Europe, the US, the Middle East and Africa. And I mentioned at the start as well that we've also added Canada, so we've expanded the number of markets to 31 globally now. So we truly are getting a good view of these people across the entire world. And when I talk about them being those most senior business people, they really are. Look, I mean, we can see here from this chart, almost over 2/3 are C-suite owners and partners, and they exist in the biggest companies as well. Average number of employees in the companies they exist within is about 1,500, and all this is global data that we're touching upon here. And I've got 3 charts next, each with a sort of number on them, and I think that really helps to reinforce the importance of the audience that we're talking about. The first number is 10 trillion, and this is all about the total budgets that these people control. Okay, so it's an enormous amount of money that they're in charge of in terms of budgetary spend, and this is the solution that helps you tap into these people to look at how you can influence where these purchasing decisions are made. Switching it up a bit now, going into personal, average net worth here of almost $1.5 million. So many of these people are high net worth individuals, and these are the people that banks and financial institutions want to speak with. They've also got big salaries as well, almost $500,000. So they're big consumers of high-end luxury goods, but there's also new revenue streams here as well that flow into financial investments, for instance, but big disposable incomes, some of your most important consumers for high-end consumer goods and luxury services. Now, at the start, I mentioned a little bit about how we continue to develop the solution. It's really important for us that we continue to provide you with more insight year on year, so it gives you a better idea of how you can understand this audience, so you can more effectively reach and communicate with them. Now, first development we've made is a new approach to understanding brand engagement, and there's 2 levels to this. We first of all ask about what factors do the global business influencers consider important when consuming either general news or business news. So examples of this are things like, does content have a balanced view? Does it have expert opinions? Is it accurate and factual, etc.? So we ask that at the top line level, just generally about their view on it, but we also ask it at a brand level as well. So we'll ask it about the media brands that we consume as well. So it allows you to understand the types of content that different audiences within GBI are more likely to engage with and which brands can help deliver on those factors. It's also useful as well from a media owner perspective if you wanted to look at dialing up or dialing down different areas and adjust your content strategy based on this. Now, as previously, we've been asked by people to expand on certain new areas, and podcasts was one last year. And similarly, we've had the question, can you help us understand more about these people's consumption of social media? On the main solution, of course, we capture the social media brands that they're consuming content from and the frequency and recency on which they do this. But within the barometer survey, which is that recontact survey from the main people, and we recontact about 1,500 people. Within this, we're also asking them questions around the type of content that they're consuming, who they're engaging with on social media, but also where they're consuming social media and when they're consuming it. We're then also looking at factors as well that influence business and consumer decisions. Now, within this, we've always looked at factors that drive purchase decision making in things like luxury. So is it provenance, is it heritage, is it sustainability, etc. What we've done is we've expanded this. So we've gone on to look at what factors influence the decision to stay in a certain hotel or go fly with a certain airline. So it's things like, is it to do with value? Is it to do with the quality of service, loyalty points, etc.? And we've also asked as well a broader question in B2B about what's going to make you work with certain suppliers. And Dan's going to talk a little bit more about this information, but it's things like how important is cost versus the quality of service versus things like sustainability that, of course, is talked about an awful lot. And of course, I've talked about Canada, so we're getting more global, we're covering more areas, it's giving you more insights into these people in more markets than ever before. And the last point, perhaps not a new development, but quite a recent one, and I think it's something that's really worth emphasizing, is that we continue to fuse the main survey with the barometer survey data. Now, this is a really important thing, that it just can't be underestimated, the type of insight that this can provide. Because what it's allowing you to do is it's allowing you to cross-analyze these two surveys. So for instance, on the main survey, I could look at different C-suite functionalities, such as CEOs, CMOs, and CFOs. And I could understand about how their challenges that they see facing their companies differ, for instance. You could also start to cut it and look at different, like the podcast consumption or the social media consumption as well, to get a better understanding of how you can reach different targets on social or via podcast consumption. So look, lots going on here as the survey develops. As I said, Dan's going to touch on some of this, but now really pleased to be able to hand over to Dan, who's going to go into the data in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. Good to see you all, and it's an interesting one for me being presenting to you, because this is obviously my favorite Ipsos syndicated survey, and so really pleased to be able to take you through kind of some of the results for it. There is a little bit of lag on my side, so apologies for that. But just for those of you who don't know me, as James said, I'm head of marketing and business development in the audience measurement service line. And what I thought would be really interesting is for us to take a moment and as we start thinking about kind of the current business challenges, it's good to kind of contextualize that and take a step back and look at the challenges that business leaders faced in 2019. Because as we all know, the world has changed just a little bit since then. And so some of the main challenges, if you can see on slides here, these are the top 5 business challenges in 2019. they are what I like to call kind of the business fundamentals, essentially. So technology, innovation, data, security, all of these factors were factors that are very much within the control of business leaders. And so, the only thing that was really stopping business people from building better products, being more innovative, leveraging kind of more advanced technology was essentially the budgets that they had, and the budgets that were at their disposal. If you go forwards to today and you have a look, and you can see here kind of what are the biggest external, or what are the biggest factors that are influencing their business decisions and business challenges today, it's very much kind of external factors. So it's things such as inflation, it's the price of fuel, it's attracting top talent, and this is something that we've seen that has, particularly in the US, actually has grown in terms of being a business challenge. COVID-19 is still an important factor, and all of these things are really having and playing an impact in terms of supply chain management. So with that, you can see that we're moving from a state where there were lots of things that were within the control to an area now where business leaders are facing and trying to deal with things that are unfortunately out of their control, because the external forces such as the war in Ukraine or COVID-19 are things that they're having to kind of manage and mitigate and can't necessarily change per se themselves. So what we're really witnessing, as I alluded to there, is really a shift in mindset from our business leaders. In 2019, it was all about kind of growth. It was, how do we drive our businesses forwards? What are the things, and what are the opportunities that we really want to kind of take advantage of? Today, however, the world that we're living in, and particularly from where I am right now, there's a lot of uncertainty and instability. But this is really something that's going all around the world. We're seeing increased kind of political tensions, be it the war in Ukraine, be it what's going on in Taiwan, be it kind of the lingering effects of COVID. We're seeing that business leaders essentially are having to pivot and change their strategies, and their mindsets are really moving from growth and advancing and trying to improve, to actually more of a protection and almost a survival mode. Many business leaders now are really fighting to survive, to make sure that their businesses actually stay in existence. What is interesting, I think, though, thankfully, and I will say thankfully, is that when we start digging into data and we look at COVID-19, we're seeing that actually COVID-19 across the different regions is having less of an impact and is deemed to be less of a business challenge today. So you can see across the board, around the world here, year by year, this is coming down, which is great. We can see that European business leaders feel the least threatened, or the least threatened, when it comes to COVID-19, followed by those in the States, and then we see our Asian counterparts here. And I think the Asia figure, if I just take a moment to talk about that, I think it's quite interesting, because obviously in Asia, they've been operating and dealing with COVID in a different way to kind of Western countries in that way. They've also been hindered and impacted by SARS in the past. So it's in a way no surprise that actually they feel that the challenge for them, a key challenge for them, is still kind of public health crises. And it's actually on a similar level to inflation, which I'll talk a little bit more as we go through this presentation. What I should also say, as James alluded to, some of the figures you will see is for the US, and some of the figures are for North America. When we're trending in particular, because we've only added Canada this year, you'll see it's just the US. So talking about inflation, this is a common challenge. It's something that everyone is kind of talking about. We've seen kind of near double-digit growth, or double-digit highs, I should say, in kind of the main kind of Western countries. In the US, for instance, you hit a 40-year high in June. We're seeing kind of real problems and real increases in inflation in the UK and across the rest of the Eurozone. So it's perhaps no surprise in that way that the proportion of GBIs citing that the cost of fuel as one of the biggest challenges their company is facing is at an all-time high. And actually, we've been running, and GBI has been running for a long time, under different names at the same time, and under different guises. But it's never been this high. The last time that the price of fuel was this high was essentially 2013. So that's quite a big change. And what I wanted to kind of share is also, this is something that is really being felt across the world, and it's being felt by both business leaders and the general population at the same time. In our recent study, we've got a study called What Worries the World. This runs every month, and it looks at kind of what are the factors that are obviously on people's minds. It was the 14th time that inflation has grown and increased in terms of being a worry for people. And it is now the #1 concern globally, with about 4 in 10 or 2 in 5 essentially saying that inflation is the top issue that they really want their country to be focusing on. So broadly, what we're seeing is between business leaders and the general population, actually, we're seeing that they're aligned around the concerns of inflation. But what's interesting is actually when you start looking at inflation, you start looking at different countries, particularly in APAC. And I talked about this a couple of slides ago about you know, a health crisis and COVID posing a bigger challenge potentially versus inflation. This isn't necessarily the case for every market. And you can see here in terms of China, for instance, that actually the rate of inflation in China is relatively normal. It's around 2.5%, whereas countries such as India, Singapore, and South Korea are far higher at around 6 to 7%. And what's interesting, I think, is when you start looking at the data for GBI, off the GBI study, and you start drilling into kind of the China data, you know, we all know China is unique, and China particularly have been implementing, you know, a very different approach when it comes to COVID. And so for them, they've had this zero COVID strategy. And so they've continued to implement kind of lockdowns. And for instance, in July, they actually locked down the city of Wuhan, which has a population of about 1 million people, just because there were 4 cases of COVID. So you can see for them that this is why actually COVID is so important and why public health crisis is very, very top of mind for them, because essentially the way their governments are making certain decisions. And that said, inflation, as you see here, is still third in terms of being a biggest challenge for China. So they're not immune to the effects of inflation nonetheless. And I think, you know, what's interesting is when we compare kind of the data for inflation versus a public health crisis, you can see that there are differences between the markets, and they really kind of correlate at the same time to what's going on in those markets. And so for me, when I look at this data, actually it kind of reassures me that actually the data that we have is a true representation of actually what's going on in the world at the moment. So you can see that inflation, for instance, is deemed to be much more of an important problem in, say, Singapore, South Korea, which has higher levels of inflation than, say, China. Conversely, you know, going back to the public health crisis point, you can see again that there's different perspectives. And South Korea also had quite a unique approach in terms of how they tackled that. But inflation is a global problem. You know, it's also a it's also a local problem in North America and to American businesses. But it is a problem for all business sizes. You know, be it, you know, an SME, be it a large multinational enterprise. All companies essentially are really feeling the impact of inflation. It is one of the biggest challenges that they are facing today. And the cost of living and the impact of all of these, external economic factors are really hitting and hampering kind of small businesses. They are really the ones that are at the most risk with this. And so it's perhaps, you know, no surprise that, as you saw in the last chart, that it's really something that they are really struggling to challenge and to deal with, because with people spending less, you know, as we potentially edge closer to kind of a recession, you know, what we're seeing is SMEs are really fearful for the future, and you know, they're feeling like the only option they have is to increase their own prices, but in doing so, that means that they're less competitive. And so what we're seeing though is, and I think it's really interesting when you start looking at kind of the optimism of business leaders, is the fact that when you look at the data for the optimism for their own company or their own role, actually they're still quite optimistic about it. And so you can see here that business leaders, and you know, we kind of all know kind of senior decision makers and C-suites, they like to be in control of things. They are far more optimistic about things that they can control versus things that they can't. And so you see here, in terms of their optimism for the world and the optimism for their own country, it's actually far lower. So you have about half being optimistic about, you know, the outlook for the world. So the big challenge for this year and the big focus for business leaders this year is really, how do they control the uncontrollable? And I think what's interesting is, you know, when you start looking at this year by year, and so here you can see 2021 versus 2022, we're seeing a particular big shift in the US, where optimism was far higher versus optimism today. In Europe, in Asia, there are slight differences. They're not really that significant. But you can see definitely in the US, we're seeing some impact and some differences there. Part of this is probably down to the fact that, you know, at the beginning of the year, the US, you know, like the rest of the world, was substantially hit in terms there was a correction when it came to technology stocks. You know, we're seeing kind of high inflation, and so I think that's kind of what's being reflected within the data at the same time. And so these are areas where, you know, you would expect that they need more support, and these are things that brands need to be thinking about as to how they can help kind of GBIs. Last year, you know, a huge thing and a huge focus for business leaders last year was really around climate change, and we had many kind of countries and companies kind of promising and setting kind of new sustainability targets. You think back to kind of COP26 last year, and it was probably the biggest conference, you know, climate conference anyway, that had ever been held. I think what's interesting is if you think about this year, and sorry, I'm trying to stifle a sneeze at the same time, so apologies. But if you think back to COP27, essentially, not many people are talking about COP27 this year. You know, it's not really a thing, and that's despite the world getting warmer. That's despite the fact that, you know, we've all gone through a summer of extreme heat. And I think part of this is because the biggest challenge for business leaders today is really the fact that people are spending less. You know, prices are going up, brands are becoming less competitive, and so we're seeing the first-hand impact of a rising cost of living. And so for business leaders, they're really kind of focusing on those problems as opposed to focusing on tackling kind of climate change. And this is really kind of seen, you know, in our data when you look at kind of the business challenges for this year, with just 5% of North American business leaders or GBIs citing that, you know, it's a problem for their, and it's a challenge that they're facing for their company right now, which is a significant drop versus last year. And it's also really interesting when you compare versus Europe, for instance, where Europe it's also dropped significantly, but is at 15%. So you can see here inflation, the price of fuel, attracting top talent. These are the main issues that business leaders are really kind of considering and thinking about today. And as I was thinking about this, you know, it got me thinking about kind of a film that I don't know if you've all watched Superman 3. I'm maybe showing a little bit of my age there. Yes, I am a little bit of a geek in that way at the same time. But there's a part of the film essentially where you have firefighters who are fighting flames, and they're really kind of trying to dampen down those flames. And you have scientists who are watching nervously as the flames are heating the building, and essentially what's happening is the uranium is getting hotter and hotter. And so I think this is kind of a good analogy as to what's going on, in that business leaders essentially are fighting the flames of today, but they also are nervously looking to the future and thinking about, oh, you know, what do we maybe need to think about and what do we need to do? And so it's interesting essentially to see kind of those kind of challenges, and particularly around kind of attracting top talent, because that's definitely risen quite a bit in the US versus other markets. Now, I said looking ahead, you know, the next 5 years, you know, the fact that business leaders are possibly being a bit nervous when it comes to climate change. I think also what you need to factor in is also kind of the time span in terms of what is that going to look like and where it is. And so you can see here, because of this mindset of trying to focus and fight today, the 5-year outlook actually when it comes to climate change isn't that high. And I think also part of that is because if you think about, you know, some of the policies that have been put in place, some of the targets and expectations, they're actually much further on. Most of the new policies are actually starting in 2030. And if you think about when CCPA, for instance, came out in the US, the way that businesses operated, even though they knew it was coming, tended to be a little bit more last minute, and it was a little bit more reactionary. And so that's why I think when it comes to climate change, whilst it might not be seen as a direct challenge to businesses today, it doesn't mean that it isn't on their radar. And we see that within our data as well, because we're seeing essentially that all business decision makers and C-suites agree across the world that companies must take responsibility. We're seeing that they feel that it's very important that businesses and leaders are really protecting the environment. We see in our data that they really need to be kind of improving society, and they need to be practicing good governance. And these are all, three of the pillars of ESG. And specifically, I think, as you see from the data here, 4 in 5 essentially say that it's important for big businesses to be protecting the environment. If we look at kind of other data that Ipsos has, and something that we see from the general population, again, we see very much a similarity between business leaders and the general population. So we see here essentially 61% of the general population agreeing that businesses must act and must do something to combat climate change. Otherwise, they'll be failing their employees and customers. And this data has come from a survey which we conducted, which we published on Earth Day, which was measuring 31 different markets around the world. Going back to ESG, so ESG is definitely on the minds of business leaders. It's definitely on the minds of consumers. And I think it's positive to see essentially that, when it comes to how important it is for business leaders, companies, and business leaders, clients, you can see that almost 7 in 10 essentially are saying that it is important. And so it's something to bear in mind and something to think about. But there is something that needs to be thought about, which is really considering the differences between kind of ESG and sustainability. And what we're seeing as well is that sustainability, depending on your company size, actually has a bigger or smaller kind of impact on your business. And you can see here, as we start looking at the data by different companies, that actually it's the far larger ones that feel that it is a greater impact and a greater challenge that they need to be focusing on than the small ones. And again, I think this makes sense when you think about kind of the climate we're in. Smaller companies essentially have less budget. They don't have the deep pockets that maybe bigger companies have to kind of ride all the waves of all the problems that we're seeing, and so they're really more in survival mode versus some of the bigger kind of multinationals who are also kind of thinking about, and they were typically the ones that announce kind of their policies and their approaches for carbon footprints, and certainly they have more at stake when it comes to their kind of financial and reputational implications. So whilst we see that sustainable practice is important, whilst we see that business leaders are really considering and believe ESG to be something that they need to focus on, as I say, they are differentiating between climate change, sustainability, and ESG, and this is something that I think that's really clear in terms of the data. And so what is important when it comes to thinking about how business leaders are choosing their suppliers, again, in the current climate, what is important is still very much quality, cost, and the service level that they're receiving. So what we're seeing across the world, and this is not just in the US, it is something that we are seeing kind of in Europe and in Asia as well, is that there is a clear say-do gap in terms of business leaders saying that they want to do something, saying that they want to act, knowing that they need to act. But actually, in terms of how they're acting and what they're doing, they're focusing very much on the now, as opposed to maybe focusing on terms of sustainability. And it isn't that sustainability isn't important. The challenge is that generally sustainable products isn't necessarily the most cost effective. We see that from a business and a consumer standpoint, these type of products tend to be more expensive than kind of the non-green alternatives. But I think, one thing to really bear in mind, and Larry Fink, who's CEO of BlackRock, said quite nicely, is sustainability isn't a nice to have, it is a must have. And I think we're starting to see it in terms of consumers and businesses, in terms of them willing to pay more attention and actually acting with their money in terms of what they're choosing to do. You see more and more consumers now actually being willing to pay for a product that is maybe perhaps better for the environment. And so, what we're seeing is, whilst they're starting to think about things, and I think it's a nice kind of transition in terms of talking about money in that way, these people are still kind of very, very wealthy individuals. So we know that business leaders, as you would expect, a byproduct of their success is very much that they are wealthy. And so the average net wealth here for a North American GBI is $1.6 million. And I think what's interesting is, they are still very wealthy, but their mindset, just like they are in business, is changing in terms of how they're acting in terms of their consumer lives at the same time. And so the focus now for them is actually much more on terms of how do they make their money work harder for them, and derive kind of better short-term returns. That said, a typical behavior trait for all kind of GBIs and business leaders is that they aren't afraid to take risks. They see moments of uncertainty as an opportunity. And so you can see here essentially almost 80% saying that they're willing to take, moderate to high risk, to really kind of grow their portfolios. But I think what's really interesting, and what we need to kind of think about, and this is something that banks and financial institutions need to really consider, is the fact that the person's high net wealth really steers and shapes kind of what they're thinking to do. So the tolerance to risk today depends on how much kind of these people have set aside. So in gold here, you've got those who have $1 million plus, and in blue, you kind of have those who have less than $1 million. And what you can see here is that those who have a higher net worth are much more likely to take risks. They're much more likely to invest and support specific ventures, specific causes, things that they really truly believe in, which are maybe more kind of long term. Whereas those that have a little bit less high net wealth, it's not that they aren't affluent people, it's not that they aren't wealthy people, but their focus is starting to change a little bit more to making sure that they're protecting what they have, and they're switching to kind of shorter term rewards. That said, these type of people, they are really shaping and driving the world of luxury. They are driving high-end consumption. They are the types of people that high-end brands really need to be communicating to. And the reason why that is because they will be continuing to spend. We've seen this throughout the years, even through COVID, where the situation they're in and the luxury that they have in terms of their disposable income means that they can still kind of enjoy the finer things in life. And so you see here, in terms of the next 12 months, you can see a strong proportion of them will continue and will be looking to replace and buy new consumer electronics. You see that a high percentage of them are looking to buy jewelry and watches. So, these types of people are really, really important targets for all kinds of advertisers, and it's not just from a business standpoint. I think this is something to think about, with the GBI data at the same time, is that it's a huge rich data set that can be used to create kind of lots of different kind of profiles and lots of different kind of segments. And just to kind of reiterate kind of why they're that important, this is just kind of a high headline figure to showcase how much that they're forecasted to spend in terms of designer clothes in the next year. So they're really the ones that are driving the luxury industry, and the ones that the luxury industry needs to be kind of focusing and targeting on. But as James said, we continue to evolve the GBI study. We're looking to hear from you. We want to know kind of where are the areas that we need to focus on. So moving on a little bit to media consumption, we've released a number of different product enhancements, one being all around kind of media engagement, which James talked about right at the beginning. I think why this is important and why this is interesting is that be it a media owner or be it a media agency, what we can help you understand is how to engage this audience, be it from your content or be it in terms of how to reach them. And so these new questions give you a better understanding of why people are consuming both general and business news. So to begin with, focusing on kind of business news, and actually across the regions, across kind of North America, Asia, and Europe, these are quite similar. the factors that are really influencing how kind of company leaders are going about and getting their information is very, very aligned, in the sense that they're looking for accurate, balanced, well-informed, trustworthy insights from experts. They're looking, unsurprisingly, to really understand what's going on in their own sector, but they're also looking to understand what's going on in the broader kind of business world. And I think when you think about these people, who they are, they're the types of people who are really shaping, the opinions of others. And so it makes sense in that sense that they're trying to get around a view. They're trying to go to different sources. And so from a business content standpoint, they are going to different channels, they're going to different medias and mediums, really to make sure that they have that kind of non-biased viewpoint, to add credibility and to really help them build their own opinions. When you look at kind of general news, again, it's slightly similar. They're still wanting accuracy, they're still wanting a balanced view. And sorry, the light has gone off in this room, so I hope that you can still see me. I'm just going to wave a little bit to kind of turn it on, and there we go. Unlike kind of business news, what we're seeing is that where people used to go to kind of lots of different sources, different platforms, actually we're seeing for general news, they're liking and preferring to go to one place. They're looking to go they're looking for a media owner who can cover a broad range of topics and give them kind of the insights of what is going around in the world of sport, what is going around in the world of entertainment, as well as business and politics. So that's a clear kind of difference in that standpoint. And this is just a snapshot and an example of kind of how we're evolving our study. And I hope it kind of showcases kind of the drivers as to, why certain people are choosing different types of media, because you can go down to this on a brand level to really understand kind of those different kind of attributes. Talking on media, GBIs, senior business decision makers, they're well informed. They like to consume media, irrespective of platform, to be honest with you. As you can see here, in terms of the last 30 days, they're consuming across pretty much all channels. They're continuing to consume print, they're continuing to consume TV, and so you can see that the best way to reach these people is really kind of a multi-channel strategy. But I think what's important is to think about kind of how they're using those mediums and why they're using those mediums. There is a definite kind of transition in terms of why people are consuming print, for instance, versus kind of how they used to consume maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago. I talked about the fact that we want feedback, and every year, we reach out to you and ask for feedback. I think, what's important and what we heard from you last year is really wanting to understand more about the role of other media and how that's impacting kind of business decision makers' lives. And, with kind of GBIs kind of return to the office, with travel increasing and people traveling more, we're seeing kind of a rise of media on the move, and it's increasing. It's playing a much bigger role, and it's playing a much bigger role in society, but it's also playing a much bigger role in terms of business leaders as a whole. So just to end, I wanted to kind of touch on a few quick insights in terms of their podcasts and social media habits. So to begin with, in terms of podcasts, we can see that there's already a strong majority of business leaders who are listening to podcasts. We saw this in data before, that in terms of podcast listening levels, business decision makers were relatively early adopters in that way. I think what we've seen from our data here is that more and more are starting to kind of dip their toe in and starting to build some sort of routine and some sort of ritual with listening to podcasts, be it when they're exercising or commuting, or even in terms of kind of in terms of their own entertainment in that sense. But what I do think is an interesting trend, and when we looked, and this is specific to North America versus kind of Europe and Asia, is actually we're seeing that there is a little bit of a fatigue when it comes to podcasts. And this is maybe something related to COVID and in terms of behavioral habits, perhaps, in that actually those consuming podcasts on a daily basis now is a little bit less frequent. And we see that there is a much more higher trend to weekly and monthly. And I think part of that is because there are so many podcasts out there now as well. And so business leaders are now having to be a bit more selective in terms of what they have and what they're listening to. But it's something to keep an eye on. It's something that we will keep an eye on in terms of kind of the data that we have to kind of inform you as to the trends there. Another thing, obviously we've added some questions in terms of social media. What we're seeing is again, this is slightly different in the US versus kind of Europe and Asia, is that predominantly across the world, business leaders and GBIs are using social media for personal use, and you can see this very much in North America. But I think what's also interesting is actually, particularly in North America, is the fact that a stronger percentage are likely to use it for business purposes, and that's far higher than, say, in Europe when you compare that. What is also interesting is there is still a strong percentage of people who aren't on social media and who are not consuming social media every day, and that might sound a little bit shocking, but I know, thinking about certain business leaders, they're very almost fearful to be present on social media because they don't want to be sharing their views, or they're worried about their personal views and their business views kind of intertwining. And so we're seeing that in our data. But I think what's interesting is when we start looking at the types of content, and it goes back to that fact that they're really using social media predominantly for a personal standpoint, is that a lot of them are turning to social media for entertainment, be it understanding what's going on in sports, cooking, entertainment, travel. They're looking and turning to it for really their personal lives in that way. And so I think what's interesting from this type of data now is that we can understand more about the why and the what, but we can also help you to understand more about the when. So just finally, what I thought, and I've talked quite a lot now, so apologize for that, but people who know me know that I do have a tendency I do like to ramble on, so I do apologize there. But I think in terms of a few kind of key takeaways, first of all, in terms of the data, what we're seeing is a real shift in terms of business leader mindset. They need to manage the unmanageable. They need to manage these changes. They need to manage the fact that there's a lot of external factors today that are impacting businesses. And so controlling the uncontrollable is a real theme. We've seen that sustainability has declined as a business priority, predominantly because of inflation, the threat of recession, and also changes in consumer behavior. But again, as we've shown, in terms of ESG anyway, ESG is still very much an important factor and something that they're bearing in mind. We also know that these people are really open to taking calculated risks. They're looking to really grow their wealth. So they unlike perhaps you and me and some other people who may be kind of bunkering down and fearful for it, they're looking to see kind of where are the opportunities for them to kind of take advantage of what's going on. And as I've shown, they also are the types of people who like to enjoy the finer things in life. They want to continue to buy kind of high-end consumer goods, be it clothing, watches, or cars. And so, they're a vitally important group from a consumer standpoint. But as I've shown, and as we increase more data in terms of social media and podcasts, we're seeing that multi-channel is key when it comes to targeting business decision makers, because they are really the types of people who like to absorb, and they really are using different platforms and different mediums for different reasons to understand and give that kind of broad kind of understanding and overview. So with that, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it interesting. We will, of course, be sharing some of this data with you, but are there any questions at all?
Good. Thanks, Dan. I know we're fairly close to, well, we're at the end here at kind of the time up at 10:15. There's a couple of questions that came through that I can quickly answer though. There was one about just expanding on the barometer questionnaire and just how that works. I mean, and how it's fused with the main survey, and just elaborating a bit. I mean, you can just cross-analyze stuff on the main survey versus the barometer survey. So on that barometer survey, there's information around media consumption, finance, a lot on ESG as well, and a lot on business challenges. So you could start to create targets out of that, and then start to profile them versus the detailed media consumption information on the main survey as well. So you could target those people that are more likely to take higher risks when investing, for instance. But do reach out to us if you have any more. Another question about remote working and its challenges in a lot of business. Very quickly, yes, there's some statements on the barometer survey about this, and we can certainly reach out to you about that. Those are the two questions. Apologies, I've rushed through that a little bit. I don't think there were any more. that came through. We'll send out a copy of the deck along with the brochure. And any questions, please do reach out to myself, Dan, and also Matthias as well, the research director on the survey.
And just one final thing before everyone goes. When I was kind of an Ipsos client, I always knew that Ipsos could help me. I always knew that there was lots of things that that Ipsos does, but wasn't always aware of it. So I thought I'd just pull out a few things that you may or may not be aware of. It'll be 20 seconds on this quickly, but TV dailies, I don't know if you've heard of TV dailies, but this is a great tool in terms of understanding everything that's going on in TV 24/7, 365. It helps you to understand kind of attribution, viewerships, and much, much more. I talked a little bit about sustainability. So we have actually got a white paper on sustainability and advertising, and it gives kind of insights as to maybe how you can approach this in a meaningful way and not greenwashing. And then the last one is a new product, actually, which is Immersive 3E. And so this is a syndicated tracker, which helps you to understand what's going on in all the new technologies. So think of AR, VR, web, 3.0, kind of metaverse. This will really kind of give you insights into the adoption curves and so forth. So I realize we've run over, and I apologize, that's very much my fault, but I hope that's also useful. Thank you very much for your time. And as James said, we will be sending a recording of the webinar, a copy of the brochure, and if you do have any questions, please do reach out and email us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.